All right, what's happening, y'all? So the Washington Commanders have come out with their official 15-man practice squad list. Of course, we got to dive into each player and why they made it to the practice squad. And first of all, why they didn't get picked up by another team, but also why they had to go to our practice squad and didn't make the 53-man roster. And then, of course, we have to talk about the players that didn't make the practice squad, especially some of the notable ones like a Stephen Parker that I really hope we bring back. We're going to dive into all of that. It's really interesting, man. I mean, a lot of people hype up our players, but I think it's very notable that no players from the Washington Commanders were claimed by any teams that we let go after we made the 53-man roster. None of them. So we had our pick at everybody that we released to cut down to that 53-man roster. We had our pick at all of them to make our practice squad. That should tell you everything you need to know. I know a lot of fans overreact over certain players getting cut, and I can understand Jaret Patterson. Like Jaret Patterson and William Bradley King as well. I felt like they were quite likely to get picked up by other teams, but granted, again, no player that we released within the past week was picked up by another team. So we were able to really have our pick at anybody that we wanted to bring back. And so, of course, we're going to dive into all of that. But before we do, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell next to the subscription button so you get a notification immediately. And every time I release an informative and opinionated video just like this one, make sure you pull up every Friday for the broadcast podcast after I get back from New York. It's the broadcast podcast where we talk about everything funny, music, sports, gaming, anime, whatever. And then make sure you pull up every Sunday during the game live streams where I'm analyzing and breaking down everything that's going on in the games live. And then, of course, pull up an hour after the game ends for the post-game live stream where I open up the phone lines. You call in, you voice your opinions about the Commanders, positive or negative. And, of course, we're going to laugh whether it's bad or whether it's good or bad. Hopefully, it's after a bunch of dubs, though. But without further ado, let's get it. Again, just to remind y'all, no players released by the Washington Commanders within the past week was picked up by another team, or at least claimed on waivers. So we had our pick of everybody. And just to put it in perspective, the Jets had 7 players claimed on waivers, including Wild Goose, who we claimed. So that should just put it into perspective as to like how some people hype up a lot of the guys that got cut and we're just distraught that we cut some people, and that just shows how the rest of the league feels about those guys. And it's not that serious. Losing some of these guys, even if they did get claimed, is not that big of a loss, and it shows by the fact that none of them were claimed. And the Jets, as bad as they are, had 7 players claimed. But let's go ahead and go down this list. You have tackle Alex Akumbulu. He looked pretty decent at times, but I believe he got hurt against the Chiefs, but apparently he must not be that hurt if he's on the practice squad. He would have just been placed on the injured reserve or whatever. Then cornerback Troy Apke, we just can't get rid of him. You just can't shake him. Right back on the roster. I mean, a super last case, break glass in case of emergency cornerback option. Of course, if there were enough injuries to the cornerback room, we're going to go with one of these other guys that we're going to talk about in Corn Elder and Danny Johnson, of course. And even if those guys get hurt, we're going to go look for somebody outside of the organization before we bring in Troy Apke. Troy Apke's on the practice squad for his special teams, and that's it. So if there's maybe an injury to Derek Forrest or Percy Butler, Cam Sims, one of our premier special teams coverage guys, the guy that goes down there and makes the tackle on the punt returner, then maybe Troy Apke gets upgraded. But until then, and of course we hope that never happens. We never hope we have that many injuries to where Troy Apke even has to be brought up, because he's going to contribute nothing on defense as a DB. And then also defensive tackle David Bada. And David Bada is really interesting because technically he's not supposed to count towards the 15-man practice squad. Technically we can have 16 with him. He would count against the 53-man roster for the regular season like the official roster, but apparently I'm seeing that he shouldn't count towards the practice squad. And then defensive end William Bradley King, of course they wanted to bring him back if they could. If there's injuries to the defensive line, he would come in. They kept Shaka Toney on the active roster because it's really hard to find a guy with that type of pass rush potential and ability right there. The type of bend he has, he's kind of a boomer bust guy, even though I feel like he has somewhat of a floor to avoid being a complete bust. But there's a lot of potential to Shaka Toney, and you just don't let guys like that linger out there. Whereas William Bradley King is the more consistent guy and the better run stopper, but he doesn't provide much of a ceiling as far as potential and something that he can develop into like a great player, potentially like a Shaka Toney could. So if there are injuries, you upgrade William Bradley King to the active roster, but hopefully we don't get to that point. Then cornerbacks, Corn Elder and Danny Johnson, and you could just apparently tell by the fact that we signed 2 6th round picks, one of them from this past draft, the other one from the previous draft that only played 5 games for the Jets, that the Washington Commanders were basically like anybody but Corn Elder and Danny Johnson. From what we saw in the preseason, anybody but those guys. We'll go and take a chance on some late round draft picks that other teams didn't like, because we know for a fact we didn't like them. But at the end of the day, a lot of us expected them to make the roster even after the bad preseason that they had. So I'm not surprised that they got brought back to the practice squad, but you could just clearly tell that the Washington Commanders were like anybody but those two. I mean, the fact that we went into the initial 53-man roster announcement with only 4 corners, they were like, hey man, we just got to figure something out, because all I know is it can't be them two, man. It can't be them. And I just thought that was hilarious. That definitely shows how much the Commanders did not like the way they performed in the preseason. Wide receiver Alex Erickson is no surprise, because there was a chance that if we kept 7 receivers, it would be him, especially with his return ability. So there's no surprise there at all. And he actually looked like a better receiver than returner in the preseason. So he's not a bad option to have on the practice squad. Then my boy from Atlanta, safety Farrah Gardner, a developmental hybrid linebacker, safety, a Buffalo nickel guy, maybe of the future. Maybe he'll be in the rotation of our future defense of like Cameron Curl and Percy Butler, Derek Forrest. Maybe Farrah Gardner is that guy next up behind those. But he's clearly not ready yet, still very raw, and I'm glad he made it back to the practice squad. Linebacker Khalid Hudson, I mean, he went from being like the 3rd linebacker on this depth chart to on the practice squad within really one off season. It's because he just hasn't looked good. I don't know what happened, but he looked better in his rookie season than he's looked the past couple of years. He looks slower. I don't know what's going on with Khalid Hudson. I really hope he's okay mentally and physically, because somebody's got to find out why he hasn't looked good and why he's just plateaued and even kind of declined in some aspects. And then, of course, guard Nolan Laufenberg. I expected them to bring him back just for depth. You got to have some offensive linemen on your practice squad. Wide receivers Kyrick McGowan and Mark and Michelle. I'm very happy about those, especially Mark and Michelle. Of course, he's Sony Michel's brother, my Georgia Bulldog guy, who just got signed by the Chargers. Congratulations. And then a little bit of chaos in the middle, and to end up on the Chargers after winning a ring with the Rams. That sounds like a great life to me. But Mark and Michelle is one of those guys that's just made some of the best plays and stood out the most so far in the offseason. Now, granted, in the preseason, he made a couple of mistakes, but he also made a couple of plays as well in that last preseason game against the Rams. But in training camp practices, he was like a guaranteed touchdown no matter which quarterback was throwing to him. He even beat Benjamin St. Juste deep down the field for like a 50, 60-yard deep bomb touchdown from Sam Howell. And then Kyrick McGowan, he was competing for one of those returner spots on the team, and so that's a nice depth guy that can catch the ball as a receiver. Maybe not the best separator, but you're also keeping him just because he can also return. Then tackle Aaron Montero. I'm not surprised by that at all. I honestly think he's one of our better players on the practice squad just based off of what I've seen from him in the preseason. I don't know where he came from, but then he was suddenly the starting right guard against the Kansas City Chiefs in that second preseason game against their starting defensive line for the most part, and he did a pretty good job, to be completely honest. And it's crazy because he's naturally a tackle, and the fact that he looked that good at guard, there's that positional flex. That's great depth right there. If we end up with enough injuries on the offensive line, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up getting upgraded to the official roster. But again, like all of these guys, I hope we don't get to the point that we need to even bring these guys onto the actual 53-man roster. Then running back Jaret Patterson, of course, we wanted him back if we could. I'm a little bit more surprised that he didn't get picked up by another team, but of course, if he didn't get claimed on waivers by another team, we were bringing him back, because I'm pretty sure it was a tough decision between him and Jonathan Williams. It's always been Jonathan Williams over Jaret Patterson since the offseason started. I saw that coming a mile away, but Jaret Patterson balled out in the preseason so much that I'm just still very surprised that he didn't get claimed by another team. But thank goodness we were able to bring him back. And if there's a certain injury that happens in the running back group and maybe if Brian Robinson isn't as ready to go as we think, and they end up putting him on some type of list and he has to miss a minimum 4 games, Jaret Patterson is easily next in line to make the 53-man active roster, the for real roster. And then center John Toth, the worst player on our practice squad. I just don't understand. He was out there getting beat badly by 4th stringers and 3rd stringers against the Ravens. It was looking like he was going against Daron Payne, Jonathan Allen, Aaron Donald, and Fletcher Cox, and Chris Jones. Like, you would think he was just going against straight all-pro guys the way he was getting beaten that Ravens game. But it was 3rd and 5th string defensive linemen, so I'm not exactly sure why we brought him back. I prefer to take my chances on just any old random center that's out there, because I already know what I've seen from John Toth, but it is what it is. I felt like he was just as bad at center as DeJuan Neal was at corner. He may have even been worse, honestly, but we, I guess, don't have any other real options at center right now. Tyler Larson is on the PUP list along with Chase Young. Chase Rillier is still recovering from his injury that he dealt with, but he should definitely be starting week 1 against the Jaguars, but there's still some injury concerns there. Wes Schweitzer, another center, technically backup center and interior offensive lineman, also recovering from injuries, but he should be ready week 1 versus the Jags. And then Keith Ishmael, I guess, was just so bad that he was worse than John Toth. And I don't know, man. Both of them I felt like were pretty bad. And what I saw from John Toth on the Ravens, I just refuse to believe Keith Ishmael was that bad. But Keith Ishmael also was not good. So I'm not surprised that he didn't make the practice squad. I'm just surprised that John Toth made the practice squad over him or really anybody else. Also, they've already announced that so far it looks like defensive tackle Justin Hamilton, linebacker Trey Walker, and my boy safety Steven Parker will not make the practice squad. And that came out even before they announced the official practice squad that I just gave y'all, and it looks like they're just completely not even interested in those guys, even if a spot opens up, because they announced that they would not bring those guys back again before they even officially decided who was going to make up the entire practice squad. So I gotta go ahead and say my goodbyes to my boy Steven Parker, because even if we lose somebody in the practice squad, somebody claims them, or we have to upgrade one of the guys from the practice squad to the active roster, I still don't think Steven Parker would be called up. But man, it was a fun ride. That Panthers game, he literally looked like my Georgia Bulldog Lewis Seen out there, but then he didn't flash any of the other games. I didn't even notice him in the Chiefs or the Ravens game. And the Ravens game at best had 2nd stringers out there, but for the most part when he was out there it was 3rd and 4th stringers and guys that clearly weren't even making the Ravens roster, and he still didn't shine in that game. So I'm not surprised that he didn't make the roster, but I was rooting for him, man. I really was, just based off of what I saw in that Panthers game. But yeah, man, that's the end of this video. Please get in the comment section, let me know how you feel about everything discussed in this video. Please leave a like on this video if you liked it, if you learned anything. Also, let me know how you feel about everything that went down with the practice squad, everybody that we did sign and everybody that we didn't sign. And do you agree with me who's the good practice squad players and who are not? Of course, I appreciate all the support, man. Shouts out to all of my sponsors, especially my Pro Bowl sponsors whose name you see scrolling on the screen right now. I'm gonna catch y'all later. I'm out.